Delighted to be here and thank you for having me. I hope you're all well and got a chance to maybe give some time to recharging the batteries over the Christmas after a pretty crazy 12 or 9 months. I've been following the Dirty Salad Club for the last couple of months and really enjoying the content. So I thought it might be interesting to bring a subject that I suppose I've been thinking about a lot and researching over the last couple of years. And that's the whole area of time. And as Julie said, our relationship with time. So I'd like to kind of talk about the business case for time, why I think it's particularly relevant and interesting at the moment. I'm going to share a little bit of my story and why it became particularly relevant for me. I'm going to look at some of the research. And again, this is a huge topic. So I'm just going to talk about some of the things that I found really interesting in looking at this subject. And then we're going to leave some time for discussion at the end as well. So we'll put the topic out for us all just to have a bit of a play with and a talk about at the end of the session. So before I do any of that, I'd love to know how you all are feeling today. As I go through the talk, I'm going to use a tool called Mentee Meter, and some of you might be familiar with it and some of you might not. But I'm going to ask you just to grab your phone, if you don't mind, and just to go to mentee.com, so www.mentee.com. And I'm going to ask you to enter the code that's there on the screen. And what I want to know is just how are you today? How are you feeling? So we'll just try out the tool. As I said, I'm going to use it as we go through the talk. But I'd love to know, how are you feeling today? Are you feeling flat, elated, excited, completely anonymous, all emotions welcome? So how are people feeling today? Great. Okay. So a good mix of emotions here, from energized to curious, to busy, to weary, to relaxed. Okay, great. Well, all emotions welcome, and thank you for sharing those. And great to see everybody here today. So as I said, I'm going to use this tool as we go through, so you can keep your phones nearby if that's okay. So thank you for sharing those. Okay, so let's get cracking. Okay, so why do I think that the subject of time is particularly relevant at the moment? Over the last couple of years, I've been really interested in working with clients and doing research in the area of remote and flexible working. My company, Train Remote, as Julie mentioned, works with managers and leaders and teams in transitioning to remote and hybrid working. And over the last kind of 9 months, I've had a pretty bird's eye view into how these changes are impacting at different levels. So for me, one of the most exciting changes is this shift from line of sight management to results-based management that we're starting to see within organizations. And a lot of you will be familiar with the idea of line of sight management. This is kind of originating from the industrial era, where a manager's responsibility was to visually oversee what their direct reports were doing. And over the years, this kind of resulted in some cultures that we may have all experienced, where presenteeism was very much the state of play, where there was overwork, burnout, and where performance was directly linked to presence. And I suppose what we're seeing now for remote work to work effectively is the need for a shift to more results-based management. And this is a game changer, because now we're measuring performance based solely on output. So in that, how we use our time will determine the results we get, and in many cases differentiate high performance from low performance. So don't get me wrong, lots of organizations are doing remote wrong now. So they're transitioning are translating that presenteeism culture from organizations into the online space. And I'm sure many of you are seeing the impact of that now with people, but remote work done properly does require kind of this fundamental shift from line of sight management to results-based management. And I think this might be one of the most fundamental shifts we see in working practices in our lifetime. So for me, time and our relationship with it is going to be ever more important if we want to enjoy all the potential benefits that remote and flexible working will offer us. I suppose what's really interesting is that while kind of flexible working and autonomy kind of brings lots of benefits, there's also challenges and watch-outs too. What's really interesting about autonomy is that while it's linked to lots of benefits like better work-life balance, job satisfaction, engagement, research has also kind of shown us that the degree to which we can manage autonomy is dependent on our control capabilities. So our capacity to manage the autonomy we're being given. And this is some research by Bazerman in 1980. And I think this quote kind of captures it really well. Our ability to manage autonomy is dependent on congruence between our control capabilities and the amount of control we're given. So some of you might have seen this. For some people, this shift to flexible working has been seamless. And it's opened up the ability for them to manage their work around their lives outside of work, and it presents lots of opportunities for kind of greater control over work-life balance. But for others, this increased control and autonomy can be experienced as something quite stressful, particularly if we've come from very structured environments. So where there's a shift to greater autonomy, it requires now that individuals create their own structure and manage their own productivity. And again, control and autonomy need to be congruent with our ability to manage it. So I think fundamental to our ability to manage flexible and results-based working is our personal capacity to manage our own time effectively and produce the best outcomes then for us to enjoy the opportunities that remote and flexible working offer. So I guess I'm making the case that if we're looking for ways to support people's well-being and to try and maintain levels of productivity, understanding and supporting people's time awareness is really useful. I suppose time is a huge topic, and it's been analysed by nearly every discipline in one way or another over the last number of years. And our relationship with time is a huge topic. So as Julie said, I'm going to narrow it down today just to looking at some of the individual differences that can impact our relationship with time. I guess we can probably all accept that, you know, time is fairly objective. There's only so many days, weeks, hours, months. But our relationship with it in the same breath is, you know, we can also admit is probably quite subjective. So in the context of psychology, it can be said that what time is depends on how we think about it. And the way we think about it is related to our personality, our experience, our upbringing, our culture. And I think in terms of self-awareness and self-development, if we can understand our relationship with time at an individual level, we can bring about really positive change in development of our own relationship with time. So today I'm inviting you to think about time for a little while. And in doing so, I suppose I want to share just very briefly with you what I've learned along the way from being a pretty poor time manager to having a much better grasp on my relationship with time now. So rewind back 6 years ago, I was midway through a master's, I had a new baby. I had 2 part-time flexible remote roles. I had a partner who worked shift, and the icing on the cake was my self-proclaimed reputation as a very poor time manager. So it was kind of sink or swim. And in good old psychologist fashion, I decided the easiest one of these things to try and tackle was my relationship with time. I had a more kind of flexible working arrangements and autonomy than I've ever had, but I also probably had more demands on my time than ever before. Some of us can probably relate with current maybe homeschooling situations. But what I learned was how I thought about time at an individual level really impacted my time management behaviors. So I thought it might be useful to share with you some of the things that I kind of found particularly interesting along the way. I'm going to try and talk for maybe not longer than 20 minutes. I'm not going to get close to covering all the interesting topics in the area, but hopefully I can give some food for thought and some things we can use for discussion. Okay, so let's start with maybe a question, and this is where I started. So we'll go back to our Mentee Meter again, and I'd like you to pull up the same Mentee, and I'd like to ask you just to think about how good do you think you are at managing your time? So just give us a second there before you enter. Okay, so you should have a fresh Mentee screen there. So how good do you think you are at managing your time? Okay, great. Okay. We kind of seem to be averaging out around the 6 mark, 6, 7. Okay, and we can see the spread of scores there. I think if I was to roll back 6 years ago, I was definitely down at the 2 or 3 on this scale. Okay, so as a starting point, that for me, that kind of raised the question of, did our confidence and our efficacy in how we manage our time translate to our actual ability to manage our time? So thank you for sharing where you're at. So it turns out that our efficacy and our belief around our own ability to manage our time does impact our performance. So going back to, I'm sure you're all familiar with Bandura and his theory around self-efficacy, kind of that idea that if we have the conviction that we can successfully do something, we're more likely to be able to do it. And this translates into research around time as well. So research has indicated that a positive, significant relationship exists between time management and self-efficacy. Okay, so I wanted to share with you just a rough kind of reflection of a conversation I had a couple of years ago with a client that I think kind of captures this pretty well. And the client had come, they were really struggling with work-life balance. And they started talking about, how much they had on their plate, and kind of this assumption that, talking about being a terrible time manager. And I suppose as a coach, kind of being aware of this kind of self-efficacy piece, I kind of challenged that assumption. And when she was reflecting on it, she said, well, to be fair, I've kind of admitted I've kind of achieved a lot over the last couple of years. So realistically, I couldn't be that bad. And so I asked her then just to play with that truth that maybe she was a good time manager, and think about what that would feel like. And I'm only roughly remembering kind of the answer, but the gist of it was that, she would feel less powerless, and that she could take control of her time rather than, and I really like this, just being a victim of my own poor time management. And I thought this kind of illustrated perfectly the impact of our beliefs on our behavior. And examples like this have really reinforced to me the power of our own kind of self-narrative in all this. So step one for me was kind of reassessing my perception of myself as a time manager, challenging beliefs that I had, and changing my narrative. And what she mentions here also, I think, is really interesting in relation to control. And I guess this brings me on to the next area that I want to talk about. But I'm going to ask another question before we do that. I'm going to ask you to go back to the Mentee again, and I'm going to ask you to share with me to what degree you agree or disagree with the statement, I feel in control of my time. So to what extent do you agree or disagree with the statement, I feel in control of my time? So 1 being strongly disagree and 10 being strongly agree. Okay, so a good spread of scores there. And I think this question is also really interesting, and was a really interesting question for me when I kind of reflected on it as well. And it brought me on to this area of kind of perceived control of time, and our perceptions around our own control of time. And the definition of perceived control of time is kind of a sense of mastery over how one allocates one's time. And there's kind of correlations with perceived control of time and well-being, job satisfaction, and positive time management behaviors. And I think this is really interesting from a flexible work perspective, because where people have this perception of control, of flexibility over how they manage their time, we get a host of benefits, this job satisfaction, well-being, and time management behaviors. And I think this is really relevant to now, and how this is playing out in organizations over the last couple of months. Particularly organizations who aren't doing remote right and are maybe trying to replicate the presence of the office online. And I hear people saying, my diary is booked up for me. People can just go in and book meetings with me. People have open access to other people's diaries with no sense of control on their part. And I think this is really dangerous territory if we think about this idea of perceived control of time and how that's taking away this perception of control that people might have. As managers, I think it can be really important to be aware of the impact of perceived control of time, and how I think fostering a sense of it is really important. And really interesting research done around, organizations where flexible work was available. Even if people didn't use that flexibility, they had the perception of control of time, or their perception of control of time was increased. So the very fact that flexibility was there, let people feel like they had more control of their time. So it's really interesting to think about from a flexibility perspective as well. So I'm going to move on to the third area that I want to talk about, and there's only 4, so don't worry. The third area that I want to talk about is just temporal awareness. And what I want to ask you is to think about on the Mentee is how good we are at accurately estimating how long things take to do. So to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? I'm good at accurately assessing how long things will take to do. Here we go. So to what extent do you agree or disagree with that statement? Okay, interesting. Okay, so really widespread scores on this one. So some people strongly disagreeing, others strongly agreeing, and a lot of us in the middle. Okay. Okay, guys, thanks for sharing that. And I suppose this brings me on to the next area that I found particularly interesting in my research, and this was kind of the area of temporal awareness. And I guess temporal awareness is the belief that time is kind of a real and finite resource, and it needs to be budgeted. And those people with high temporal awareness, they tend to understand the temporal cost of things. They tend to be really good at estimating how long things will take them to do. People with lower temporal awareness tend to be less good at estimating this and how long things will take them to do. And elements of our personality can really impact here, or elements of our disposition. So things like optimism can really impact our temporal awareness. So for me, this was a big area of development. I was really good at planning and organizing and had a real preference for structure, but I still found myself at the end of the day not getting through my to-do list, rushing from one meeting into another, overestimating how much I could get done. And it was only when I started to understand this notion of temporal awareness that I started to see how it was impacting me, and how my eternal optimism was maybe becoming a handicap when it came to kind of temporal awareness. Luckily, kind of the research supports that temporal awareness can be built. So kind of using tools and using kind of time tracking and time reflecting tools and devices, I was able to start kind of increasing my temporal awareness. So learning how long it was taking me to do things, and then creating a feedback loop for myself in terms of accurately reflecting how long things would take me. And then I was more able to plan more correctly. So I think that, here we can maybe start to see some of the challenge to kind of standard time management training, where, those with temporal awareness tend to have better kind of time management training outcomes. But that's because time management training often assumes that one size fits all, and maybe is kind of fundamentally flawed in that kind of, we need to understand the individual differences and the individual relationships that with time that contribute to how we use it. So the last area that I want to look at, and this kind of builds on this whole idea of individual differences, is this idea of time perspectives. And some of you might have come across some of the work by Philip Zimbardo in this area. Some of you probably know Philip Zimbardo from the Stanford prison experiments. And he did lots of work and research in the area of kind of evil and heroism over the last number of years. But over the last couple of years, he's focused his attention on this area of time. And himself and John Boyd from Google spent a lot of time doing research around time perspectives. And they created an inventory to measure different perspectives that people have. So I thought we might just try a couple of the items from this inventory. So we'll flick back to the Mentee again, if that's okay. And the first question that I'd like to ask you is when you think of the past, do you mostly focus on the negatives or the positives? Okay, so for some people it's the positives, and for some people it's the negatives. Okay. Okay. And the next question that I want to ask you from the inventory is, what is more important to you, your present self or your future self? These are big questions. I feel like I'm making you do work when you probably just wanted to sit and listen. Sorry, guys.
Jen, will we do, when it says item 1, is that present?
Yes, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry. The first is present and the second is future. Thanks, Julie. Okay. And this is my last question, I promise. After this, you won't be using the Mentee anymore. But the last question from the inventory that I thought we might try is, how much control do you feel like you have over your future? Okay. Okay, so these are just a few of the items from the time perspectives inventory, and you can take the full inventory free online at the timeparadox.com. So their research, Boyd and Zimbardo, culminated in this inventory and also in a book called The Time Paradox. But if you're interested in exploring that more, you can do it there. But just to explain the 5 perspectives that they kind of came across, I guess, in their research. So they kind of found that people in general break time down into kind of larger intervals. So what has gone before, what's present, and what's to come. And the theory they put forward is that we all divide into different temporal slots, and that we have a preference for one or the other. So let's look at these briefly. So the first is the past positive preference, and here individuals kind of have a tendency to focus on positively evaluated past. So they remember the good old times. There's rituals, records. They're kind of generally kind of nostalgic, I guess, for the way things were before. Sometimes they can be more cautious and maybe less likely to try new things. Then we have the past negative perspective, and individuals here tend to focus on kind of the negatively evaluated past. So focus on what went wrong, and negative experiences from the past still have the power to upset them in the present. And then when we look at the present frame, we have kind of the present hedonist perspective. And those are those of us who want to kind of take advantage of the pleasure of here and now at all costs, maybe more committed to enjoying the moment, maybe reluctant to postpone kind of good feelings for the sake of kind of greater gain longer term. So think Walter Mischel, marshmallow test. So these people kind of often kind of tend to take risks more easily, and maybe in some cases have more unhealthy lifestyles. Also in the present frame, we have the present fatalist. And this perspective is kind of this tendency to passively exist in the present. So kind of stemming from the belief that kind of life is governed by fate. So feeling unable to change the inevitability of the future. And in some cases that can lead to kind of a sense of maybe powerlessness and maybe anxiety and kind of risk-taking and depression. Looking at the future frame then, Zimbardo kind of talked about this as being kind of the idea that people will kind of focus on what's to be achieved. So the goals, the tasks to be done, and things that they can invest in, knowing that their investment will pay out in the longer term. An investment in future is good, but it can also play out in kind of that nagging sense of urgency, and can come at the cost of kind of maybe relationships and recreation time. So you can read a lot more about each of these perspectives, but Zimbardo argues that these perspectives at an individual level have a significant impact on kind of our behaviors, our decisions, our well-being, and kind of our general functioning. So they can be interesting to explore. I suppose what Zimbardo says, and I guess what I'm saying too, is that as you become more conscious of your attitudes and your relationship with time, you can influence them for the better. So understanding them can be really important in trying to influence them. As Jung kind of famously said, we grow from where we're planted, so I think that reflecting on our preferences and our attitudes and our beliefs around things like time, which is fundamentally important, can be really useful for us in changing behaviors. Again, I've kind of only touched on some of the topics that I found interesting. I looked at kind of the area of time efficacy, that idea of perceived control of time, that idea of temporal awareness, and just that idea of time perspectives as well. To take away, I've kind of put some questions together that could be interesting to reflect on. I put you under pressure in answering the mentees here today, but it can be interesting to think about kind of how good do you feel like you are at managing time, and what would be the impact if you believed you were a stellar time manager. Who's in control of your time, and if it's not you, what can support you in feeling more in control of your time. And then I'm sure all of us have taken a raft of different personality inventories over the years, but using that information, what elements of your personality might impact how you relate to time. And then, that whole area of time perspectives can be really interesting to look at it. And does your time perspective impact your behavior and maybe your temporal decision making as well? So I'd like to put all that out to the group. And I think it might be really interesting to maybe just go into smaller groups and just to talk about this a little bit more, particularly kind of around how an awareness of individual differences in relation to our relationship with time can impact our work, whether we're a HR manager, whether we're a coach, whether we're a leader, whether we're someone just trying to survive lockdown at the moment. How might our relationship with time and thinking about those individual differences kind of impact that? So Julie, if it's okay with you, I think we might do maybe just 10 minutes of a breakout room and then come back in and have a wider discussion and maybe some questions. That works for everyone. Anything that kind of came out in your groups when you were talking? So what kind of discussions were coming out, or were there any kind of questions or key kind of takeaways? Anybody want to share?
I'm gonna jump in first, if you let me. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was so insightful, so interesting. This whole concept, to me, it's kind of fundamental to how you live your life, isn't it? Is how you understand time and how you relate to time. A couple of kind of thoughts and observations for me is you spoke about the outcome-based versus the line of sight management. 100% agree with you. I've seen people talking about it. I haven't necessarily seen people putting it into action yet. So I'd love to get more insights on that, first of all. And the second point I wanted to make is that I did some research on for my master's last year into the concept of fitting in at work. And one of the elements in that is this idea of autonomy. And within autonomy, you can have too much autonomy or too little autonomy, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And so it sort of ties in with what you were saying about time and how we perceive time and how we can perceive the control of time. So perhaps in this new way of working, some people, they perceive that they have a lack of control over their time, and some people have not enough control. Some people have it's kind of too rigid. So it's about finding that balance in relation to how you manage your time in this new way of working. I thought that was quite interesting and ties in with the research that I did.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating part of it, and it's back to that kind of job demand control model, and I think what's really interesting in that is where people have the right amount of autonomy and control, there's lots of positive benefits, but where people aren't prepared enough or maybe haven't been given enough support to maybe manage their time or energy or productivity effectively, that can actually be really detrimental. So you're seeing negative impacts then instead of positive. So I think that's a really good, really interesting area. And I think that transition from results-based management or line of sight management to results-based management that you mentioned as well, like I think that's starting to happen more in organizations where they realize it needs to be very clear, agreed, measurable outputs for people, and those conversations need to be happening. But it's a whole shift in a way of managing people that I think will take time. But I think it's very exciting potentially for people.
Yeah. What we were saying in the room as well is there's this whole mentality around it's I took an extra long lunch, so therefore I make up for it another day, or I make up for it at the end of the day, and this perception that you have to work a certain number of hours. And you're right, it's going to take a while to shift that mentality, like, oh my God, I was so busy today, to I was so productive today because I achieved outcome A, B, and C. And it's about the productivity rather than the busyness.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then the role of managers then in being able to define those outputs and clearly agree them, and performance being measured and kind of very much around those outcomes. So, yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Aoife. That's great. Anybody on what Aoife has said, or any other area?
I think, Jennifer, I was in Aoife's group as well, and thank you so much. Your talk was really insightful, really interesting. That piece around the remote working, you know, it's a massive challenge for organizations at the moment. And I think just picking up on Aoife's point there, have you, you know, that I agree, I've heard a lot about results-based management rather than time-based management, you know, work measurement. But have you seen organizations who do this well? And, you know, what are the kind of 2 or 3, you know, golden nuggets that help an organization to make that transition, do you think?
Yeah, I suppose like what I would look at for this is kind of the organizations that are fully remote and have been for a while, or who have transitioned to remote. So like, you know, the likes of GitLab or any of those kind of companies that have transitioned to being fully remote. And I suppose in there, it's significant work with managers. So like management training around project management, you know, and really good supports around kind of creating clear deliverables. And like, let's be realistic. This doesn't apply to every organization, every company and every team. It's not possible for some roles to be so clearly defined, absolutely. But I think what we're looking for is to try and move more in that direction. I don't think we can fully do it with some roles, but definitely the companies that are doing it really well are those who are, you know, fully remote and have had to, because that's how their business kind of, it depends on them doing that. I don't know if that answers your question, Eve, but yeah.
And Jennifer, I loved what you talked about. I was in a group. I mean, I loved it. It's so obvious when you see it, the self-efficacy and the time management. Never made that connection as temporal awareness. It's so, because you know, this big thing, time management courses don't work. We're saying that, even though they've been, consultants have been peddling. So I ran them myself for years. And they actually don't work. And I love that research. But also what I really took from you there was you had to, when you're remote working, you also had to have a kind of a co-working space, somewhere to go. You know, to be able to have that block, which is a thing, you know, that I think that's going to become huge. I thought, I was saying to the group, we working and all them, we work, or all this co-work would be in trouble, but they've never been busier. I mean, I don't know how many of you are hiding in your attic, but right now there's homeschooling going on down there, and this is much better. You know? So it is, you know, having that space as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those boundaries. And when we don't have those, I think that's what's so hard about what's happening at the moment. Like, it's not a reflection of working remote or even, you know, proper flexible working. It's so unique in that we don't have the option of creating those really rigid boundaries that can help.
Yes.
So,
and Jennifer, I did the first iteration you did with the IITD on the virtual learning, and it really gave me loads of confidence to be able to run them online as well. Great. So it's really good stuff.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
So Jennifer, this is Mary, and that was really insightful, as everybody else has said. So thank you for that. And you know, and it's so true what Alan says, is all of these time management programs don't really wash with us. You know, we've been talking about your commitments, helping you to manage your commitments rather than your time in recent times. But I'm still have a poor relationship with time myself, and I work remotely most of the time. I travel quite a bit, so I've been working a lot from home. But I think the biggest thing, as Alan said, is space. But the other thing is having a bit of structure to your day. Get up in the morning as if you're going into the office, have your own space, work out, you know, what time you're going to start and finish at, and try and stick to that. Now, I'm not the best at preaching about that, because I'm not the best at having that cutoff time. But I've been thinking more and more about, you know, what is it if I continue to work beyond that time, what is the cost of it? What am I giving up to have this? And this is how making me more conscious of my time. But yeah, we had a good discussion in our room as well. I was with Kieran, so I don't know if Kieran wants to add anything to that. But thank you so much. Really insightful.
Thanks.
I'll be definitely reading some of the books you suggested, etc.
Thanks, Mary. Great. Kieran, I'd say we just need to, I think you might be on mute. Can't hear you for some reason.
Yeah, we had some difficulty at the very beginning.
Is your computer on mute rather than Zoom being on mute or something like that?
Oh, we have you, I'd say.
I had headphones plugged in over there. It's just you started talking and started answering. I was like, no, yeah, I agree with what Mary said, but there's an awful lot of time with that self-discipline piece. So interesting thing we both agree on is it very hard. For example, such have a rigid deadline, but unless you wrap all your work bits and pieces up, it's very hard to switch off that and go on to the next thing. And I was curious with Alan's. I've done a few of those time management courses, right? It's a revelation they don't work. But I'm curious about, is it a bit like all these kind of other sessions where if you're not prepared to make the changes, of course they don't work. If you're prepared to buy into it and actually make those hard changes, they possibly do work. I'm not so sure.
And that's the doing gap, maybe, is it, where you know exactly what it is you need to do, but it's the actual doing of it, it's the taking action that people are very reluctant, myself included, to do. So you know, you have all the knowledge in the world, but you're not actually applying it.
But I find the hardest thing to do is to get up and walk away from the desk. I was just saying to Mary, a lot of my colleagues are big into fishing and angling because that's where I work, and they go out fishing, and I couldn't do that. I just couldn't enjoy it unless I had the other bits done. So you'd nearly stay at the other bits to finish those, then you know, that can sort. And that's not a good thing, but I think we agreed.
I think there's loads of elements of our personality that tie into that as well. You know, I don't know if anybody's kind of come across the MBTI, and you know, some people like in structure and to have stuff completed before they move on to the next thing. So like there's elements of our personality too, but also there's a whole area around cognitive biases that we have, you know, that relate to time too. Like, and we didn't even get to touch on this, but like, you know, even stuff like the sunk cost fallacy, you know, so that idea that like once I've started something and I've committed that I'm going to finish this report within this hour, once I've started it and I've given it an hour, if I'm still not finished it after an hour, I've got this kind of bias towards finishing, which will mean I'll feed into, or, you know, eat into the time that I plan to do other things. So like we have a whole host of cognitive biases that are working against us as well, that can be really useful to be aware of too. So that we only scratch the surface.
But Jennifer, I think it's important that with Kieran is that you can get better at time management, because you described how you did, but I suppose it's just the way managing your energy, not just time. It's the approach to it, I suppose, the mindset bit.
Yeah.
I think if I may, Jennifer, really helpful, and I think it doesn't matter how many times we know things. You know, look at this audience. All of us know all the right things to do, but oh my God, it's not always easy to do it. And I think given the current time, boundaries and some sort of structure, and you're absolutely spot on. You know, back to our self-efficacy, our belief in ourselves. If we don't, you know, it's that self-insight. I'm very creative and I love ideas and I love people, so I can connect. I feel like what I do is about tapestry building, because I'm constantly saying, oh, they should talk to them, and and I love that part. But then maybe I get distracted. I'm not doing what I actually need to do, which is I've got 3 webinars I need to finish and they're circling around my head. But I think it's around, back to what you said, Alan, about the time management courses. It's like everything, it's self-awareness, and then it's what's the structure. So if you've, you know, I've often used the Covey matrix, which I like. But then I've also added things to it as well, in terms of there's no point in having a matrix that says you've got to do 50 things this week on a simple level if you've got only 1 hour to do them, you know. So even looking at your diary, and I think it's having some sort of a structure, and I agree with you on the MBTI, certain personalities, but I find that one of the reasons I quite like some form of structure, and my creative side is always trying to kick against it, going, nah, but I make myself come back to it, because otherwise what happens is the stomach then goes, I know there's something I have to do, I know there's, you know, and then it just sort of falls. So I think, you know, minding ourselves, that self-efficacy, I think particularly in this current time, our self-belief and our ability to get things done is really important.
Absolutely, completely agree with you. And I think that energy piece as well that you touched on and Alan mentioned as well is so important too. You know, equally as important as how we kind of relate to time too, how we manage our energy at the moment.
I have a favourite question, which I think I robbed somewhere along the way which was, what's the best use of my time right now? And Janine, I think she's still on the call, said she has a similar version, but it's what's the most valuable thing I can do now? And that might be to actually take a break or do a 5-minute mindfulness, or, you know, I would find that certain times I'd be saying, no, I actually need to do mindfulness before I need to go into this. And it can be just as simple as 5 minutes. Then I'm grounded. Then I can, you know, steady the ship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really interesting, Georgina. And I think how we look at time, I mean, I'm trying to think of time. If we were to think of it like money, we'd be much more precious with it.
We would, wouldn't we?
You know, it is a valued currency, as is energy. And, you know, if we say yes to something, we're saying no to something else. Yeah. And I always think that, you know, balance, the trade-off, we need to be more mindful.
I think actually, Dara, that's a really good one in terms of the money as well, you know, where in our discussion group, it was, I think one of the things we really, particularly given all of the things that we all do as for a living, is we really have to mind our time, because we have to mind ourselves. And with all this new environment now, you have to have some sort of boundaries, because otherwise, let's be honest, the work never ends. You could work 24/7, 7 days a week, and you still won't get to where you need to get to. So it's a balance, isn't it, between not always listening to the noise, because the noise doesn't always make you feel good. So I think it's also a bit of trust your own internal state. You know, if you love social media, go for it. I applaud you. If you love the emails, fantastic. But if you don't, then put some sort of boundary around the space, because you'll drive yourself nuts.
Yeah,
John of Gods has a few places free.
I say, I think that ties in nicely with what Jennifer said at the start in relation to outcome based, and we can all take a lesson from this for ourselves. So it's not about how many hours you put in a day, and it's about, I loved the question that you had of like, what's the most valuable thing I can do right now, or what's the best use of my time right now? Because it is thinking about that, the outcome based, and what are the outcomes that you're trying to get? If you're running your own business, what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and how can you spend your time working towards those outcomes rather than kind of wasting your time doing stuff that's not adding value to the business?
I was just going to add, I actually think that's a real challenge at the moment, because I'm someone who like gets a lot of stuff done, and I just charge through the day, and my day is just completely hijacked by kids right now. So I think in a way it's a lack of self-control or a lack of control over my time. So I think it's great to say, oh, put boundaries in place, but those boundaries have been just washed away because I'm taking so much time. I left an 8-year-old reading to a 5-year-old half an hour ago. And like that probably is the most valuable place where my time, but I can't do that because it puts so much stress on me with all I have to do at work. So I think we all just need to write off January, and no one should be having a dry January right now. It's just not good. That's all I'm going to say.
I think there's another factor here, possibly, Jennifer, and thanks again. I'd just like to repeat what everybody else has said. It was fantastic. But there's also that factor of, the curveball. Doesn't matter how well you've planned for things.
Oh, God, yeah.
You have got to then be able to deal with the unexpected and the unpredictable, and how you manage that in the context of everything else that you had planned to do, and that capacity to be flexible, adapt, to know what to drop in order to prioritize this. All of that is part of it, time management as well.
Absolutely. And there's so much there around priorities, and there's so much there even around kind of values, and how our values impact how we align our time. That, as I said, we didn't get to look at today, but I think you're right. There's that, how do we hold our priorities but still maintain that flexibility, which is really important as well. So I think that's a great point.
I think, Jennifer, sorry, the values piece that you touched on there, that has been the light bulb moment for me today in terms of what you've described, and thinking about that both in terms of myself and my challenges and successes in time, and also when you're working with coaching clients, and it's quite hard thinking about accepting all the things you could and should be doing, but also reflecting on why you might be taking so long. And if you're somebody who kind of wants to do a good job, or who wants to help other people, and that's kind of ingrained there in your value base, it's quite hard in these times, I think, to sort of A, recognize that and know where that's impacting, and then B, make a stand, because it's kind of conflicting with some of your other values, and I suppose it's a judgment call as to which is going to give you the most angst, take you most out of your judgment, your comfort zone. And when you're not self-employed and working with an organization, you've got your own values against the organizational values and expectations, and they may or may not align some or all of the time as well. So it's really highlighted to me how complex it is to manage the time that we've got, really. Thank you.
And I think, just to say as well, I think it is a real challenge when we work for ourselves as well, those who are consultants or coaches, and the research shows that, when we're working for ourselves, we tend to be really aware of the value of our time, so it's heightened the value of our time, how much our time is worth by the hour, and they, as a result, people tend to feel more time pressure, who have that heightened awareness of the value of their time. So, but I think that what you're talking about is kind of the values piece as well, and how we kind of bring that into the equation as well, which I think is really important. Okay, Julie, I'm just conscious of time, and I know you just wanted to mention maybe what was coming up next week, so I'll just bring you back into the deck again if you want to just,
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much. I found that really interesting, just to echo what everyone has already said. There were some great questions as well on the Mentee Meter. It's funny how, such short questions can really, get you thinking quite deeply. Like, you know, when you were asking how in control do you feel of your future, I think on one hand I said, yeah, I'm totally in control. I have, you know, all this self-efficacy and I can influence outcomes. And then on the other hand is I have absolutely no control. Like, look at last year, that was a roller coaster that none of us asked to be on, you know. So it's an interesting one to just think of, yeah, where our perceptions are at the moment. But anyways, yes, so it's great just to be aware of those different perspectives, those different kind of perspectives of control and time. So coming up next month, so that's on the 10th of February, it'll be the Daily Salad Club will be hosted by Aoife Donovan-Lee. So Aoife is a organizational psychologist and a business coach, and she's got expertise in this area of techno-stress. So she'll be discussing some simple techniques for identifying and breaking unhealthy technology habits. So very relevant at the moment. I think most of us are spending a lot of our days interacting with various forms of technology. So I'm looking forward to that. And as usual, it'll probably be a mixture of, you know, some positive impact for us as individuals and then some insight that we can help our clients or our colleagues with. So I suppose we can hang on for another couple of minutes if anyone has any further questions. But I know some people might have to drop off. So thanks so much for joining us. And thanks again to Jennifer for hosting.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great session. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bill, Jen.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Jennifer.
Bye.